Hello, welcome to this live stream discussion. We wanted to pick up on some of the things that you've mentioned in the kind of final discussion step of the course and some of the issues that have come up throughout. Of course, you can keep asking us questions after this, and hopefully some of you will be watching it later on rather than live. So first of all, what was great was that there was lots of enthusiasm for more. So lots of people who wanted additional material on different kinds of work around the mines, but also on different kinds of workers. So just to say a bit more about how this course came about in the first place, it is one of the Working Lives portfolio. And the idea behind that was, let's look at these three key industries: railways, mining, and the textile factories in the Victorian period, because that's when they expanded drastically and when the technology changed so much that people's lives in those industries were radically altered. And there's also a kind of practical reason, which is, although this perhaps isn't the best funded MOOC on the platform, we did need some funding to, get everybody down to the big pit in South Wales and so forth. And we managed to find that by tying in these courses with an Arts and Humanities Research Council project that I work on, that you've seen me mentioning as I go along, which is the Piston Pen and Press project. So if you were thinking, why is there so much poetry and song and literature? It's actually because of the tie-in to that project, as well as because we both felt that this, gave some good insight into what workers were writing and what people were writing about the workers. So the enthusiasm for more would be amazing, but we have kind of done 12 weeks overall, so we might take a pause before doing more. It would be great to explore some of the other industries mentioned, the dock workers, iron and steel workers. I think somebody mentioned canals and
domestic servants.
Domestic servants, yeah. Lots of enthusiasm there, and those are things we'll definitely think about. But also, hopefully, other universities and academics and museums will be inspired if they see, an interest around working class history and culture, to make more courses in that field. Many of you were asking about the 20th century. Could the course expand into the 20th century, and why didn't it cover this crucial period of mining history? So I'm going to pass that over to Arthur, because he's really the 20th century expert.
Thanks, Kirsty. I think it would be wonderful to extend the course through to develop a new course on coal mining and working lives in the 20th century. There's so much to cover in the 20th century that I think it's a new course. It's another course. Yeah. We couldn't possibly do it justice, I don't think, in the 4 weeks we've got to cover coal mining working lives. And I think it is fully justified to focus on the Victorian period, because so many of the key changes occurred in that period from the 1820s through to the First World War. To be sure, in the 20th century we could pick up on mechanisation, which is one of the key changes in coal mining. And I think John Kane, in the first or second of the videos, the ex-miner from the National Mining Museum, picked up on the way he felt that work was significantly de-skilled with technological change post-45. And there's there were the key, I suppose, developments in First World War through Second World War, the creation of the National Union Mine Workers in 47, and the series of strikes in the 70s, and the pivotal strike in 84-5. So there would be such a lot of stuff to cover that, to do it justice, it merits a course.
It sounds like you're kind of talking yourself into that course, but I should say Arthur was extremely busy with many things. So maybe one day when
we'll see how it goes, Kirsty. We'll see how things go.
And there was a question about owners and managers, and a linked question about Anne Lister as a late 18th century example of women as owners and managers. This was really interesting, because it made me think we don't say much about the owners and managers, and how they might influence the lives of the workers by building villages, schools, recreation. But then, unlike the textiles, the factories and mills course, it's actually hard for me to think of really famous Victorian and early 20th century mine owners or managers who had the same status as somebody like Robert Owen of New Lanark and who we still remember today. There's not much about them in the museums either that I recall.
No, because
seeing.
I think it's difficult to locate those welfarist coal owners. I mean, there were a range of policies and strategies on the part of colliery management in the 19th century and through into the 20th century, into in the private era up to nationalisation. And to be sure, there is a spectrum. And one or two of the commentators are right to point that out, that not all coal owners were autocratic, draconian, anti-trade unionists, but I think the vast majority were. And it's maybe telling that we can't find it, or it's hard to locate these paternalist welfarist employers. There may well be one or two Quaker coal owners, but I don't know of them. So I think on the one hand, you could justify the lack of our focus and attention on owners and managers on the grounds that we wanted to focus on working lives. We were concerned to explore the meaning of work, the change in meaning of work, the way in which work evolved through the 19th century, and wanted to focus on different groups to emphasise diversity in working lives. That said, perhaps we could say a little bit more about labour management, the management of labour by coal companies, and how that evolves and changes. Certainly, as you get into the 20th century, there's definitely a move towards scientific management, towards Taylorism, and taking on board those ideas in relation to using the stopwatch and such things. But that's maybe another story for another time.
Well, I wonder if we have any examples. Nothing's springing to mind immediately, but I'm sure I can think of something of working miners who eventually got promoted to a management role, because that did occasionally happen. There are few in my Victorian files that I can think of. So we'll maybe have a look at that and see if it's something we could incorporate a bit more discussion about. And women.
As to the question of women, it's a great question, and there were very few. There would have been very few female coal owners and colliery managers. And Lister, I think, is an interesting example and a bit of an outlier. However, there were some. I did have a little look at. There's a website that lists all the colliery owners at 1880. I'll put a link on the site for the commentator that asked this question. So you can track down and see owners, and it does list some women. And I only got around to looking at the first 500, but there are several thousand pits and collieries. But of the first 500 that are listed, there are 4 female coal owners. Colliery owners. There are a
few, but very
few.
I'm not sure how hands-on they are. I have to say, I have read Anne Lister's diaries, and there's, the ones that are published and available, and there's nothing about coal in them. So I feel like the recent series about her life may have kind of presented her as more proactive as a mines manager than was necessarily the case. Though I might be wrong. I'd have to go back and look.
That particular website, Kirsty, sometimes only lists companies and sometimes doesn't give first names. So it is difficult. There might be more women.
It would be great to find a memoir of a woman.
But certainly you can identify some women owners there.
Yeah.
You could initiate some research on those. One woman owned 5 pits. So, but again, we also don't know to what extent those women were involved in hands-on pit management.
So other questions, we had a couple of questions about strikes. So sticking with issues of gender, there was a good question about women and the strikes, which again in my Victorian sources is fascinating, because I've seen 0 mention of women's involvement in the many accounts I've read of 19th century mining strikes. But of course strikes in the factories are all about women's involvement. So for those of you going on to take Working Lives in the Factories and Mills, there's actually a whole section specifically about women on strike. But have I just missed something in the mining industry? And what about when it moves into the 1900s?
I've got to say firstly, because it's a cracking question and it's an area that I think we should have said more on.
Yeah.
So many thanks for that. I think 2 or 3 folk in under 422 mentioned that. There is some evidence of female involvement in strikes in the 19th century, and I think on a number of levels. So there's certainly examples of women being involved in, for example, working during strikes, sometimes, for example, out in the local farms, working for wages, sometimes working for wages and food. For example, potatoes to keep the family going. There's lots of examples of women involved in the kind of background, in soup kitchens, in the big strikes in the 1910s and 20s, general strike.
Elizabeth
absolutely.
Andrews talks about that, actually. I mean, I was really pleased that people enjoyed hearing about Elizabeth Andrews, because she's so fantastic. But in her autobiography, actually, she does talk about organising the soup kitchens and women's support. But again, it's 1910s, 20s.
But there's also lots of evidence of women's involvement in strikes from the 1850s on. The earliest example I found is 1858. But in 1858, 1868, the 1881 strike, those strikes in the 1910s, of women's involvement, not just in that kind of passive background sense, but in a more direct and active sense. Women in coal mining communities are involved, particularly against strike breakers. So they're organising at a community level against strike breakers. They're turning out when strike breakers come in and trains or whatever to try and persuade strike breakers not to proceed. They're calling them names, so turncoats, blackleg, scab, the repertoire of name calling. They're involved in stone throwing, in acts of violence. There's examples of arrests of women on the picket line involved in these kinds of activities. And one thing that crops up, and Angela John mentions this in her work, one thing that crops up is the deliberate attempts, quite conscious attempts by women in mining communities to shame strike breakers. And directly to undermine or challenge their masculinity.
Yeah. That's fascinating. We must get some sources about that in now. I want to know more about striking women.
I'm happy to write up a step. I think this deserves a step in itself, so we'll definitely have a new step on this in week 4. And one mechanism that women used was the use of the white shirt or the night dress. But in some of these pre-First World War disputes, women would stick a white shirt or a night dress on a pole. Sometimes strike breakers would be stripped and the white shirt or night dress would be placed upon them. And the idea here was to denigrate these guys' male identities.
You're really highlighting how tough it was to be a strike breaker, and we had a question about that as well, which was a really good question. Like, what would you have done if, sometimes for very valid reasons, such as just really needing the money for your family, you felt you couldn't participate in the strike, and what was it like for you?
That was a cracking question, Kirsty. But just before I come on to that, let me just quote you this short passage on that white night dress or white shirt tactic. So this refers to a strike in the early 1920s, 1921. And this is what it says. There was a man that was lodged in the village here, and he went to work. And so we women got together. We decided to go to the pit to meet him coming out. And we had sticks and brooms, like you had one of your members pinned a white night dress on a broom. And we marched right to the pit and waited for him to come out. And when he came out, we marched behind him, bleating and calling names until he came out of a house up here in the avenue. Where he was lodging, and we chanted outside, and then we went to our homes, and we heard the next morning that he'd gone away in the night.
Wow, that was great.
This is from Angela John's book.
Let's get that memory in. But that does really highlight. I mean, my sympathy is both with the woman, but also with the strike breaker there. That's a very difficult situation.
Yep.
So.
There is.
Do we have oral histories or memories of people who didn't participate in strikes?
I had a bit of a dig around because it's actually very hard, I think, to find any material, and perhaps understandably so. Folk who broke strikes might not have wanted to tell their stories. But there is a fantastic archive of something like 200 oral interviews in the South Wales Miners Library, interviews that were done in the 1970s by Hal Francis and David Smith for their book The Fed, which I think might be on our reading list, the history of the South Wales miners. And in those 200 interviews, there are apparently 2 interviews from strikebreakers telling their stories.
Only 2 out of 200.
Only a couple, but there are also 1 or 2 comments by other interviewees on strikebreakers and on strikebreaking. And the strikebreakers themselves, I think, were emphasising the way in which they were forced to break strikes because of poverty or family circumstances, you mentioned. But there was one comment from a woman who, on strike breaking, somebody called Lillian May Price. And she says this, I think it was the fact they had families and they were hungry and they had nobody to help them. Who could blame them? They were starving like the rest of us. So I think this body of material, it's been worked through by an historian called David Salway. So I'll give David a shout out. I think this body of material suggests that there might be more nuanced attitudes within mining communities to some extent, that there's maybe a range of views, perhaps a dominant, certainly a dominant sense of opposition and resentment, quite understandably, to strike breakers who benefited from the stuff, the improvements that trade unions brought, but also perhaps some more understanding than there might be at first sight.
Yeah, I mean, from my period, what comes to mind is David Wingate's autobiography. So we actually had one of David Wingate's poems featured earlier in the course, and there was some good response to that. But when he was older, I think it was in the 1880s, he published an autobiography in quite a conservative church magazine. It was a Church of Scotland magazine, and it described how in his younger life he had felt unable to join the strike because widowed mother and siblings and people depending on his income, and how badly he'd been treated. So it was set up as a narrative episode about really the evils of trade unions, which is, to be honest, what you might expect to read in the 1880s in a middle-class Church of Scotland newspaper. But I'll try to pick that out perhaps and we can have a look at it, because it's a very interesting narrative and it culminates in him actually running away and getting lost in the mines for quite a substantial period. I think it was a day, 2 days before he found his way out, because he'd been escaping this persecution. So it might be good to look at the framing of that as well as some of the oral memories, put them together. Other questions? There was another question about strikes that was quite specific for you, Arthur. Please could you explain in what sense strikes were technically illegal before the repeal of the Combination Act in 1824?
And was the Act not enforced? Yeah, that's a good question. The Combination Acts. Yeah, the Combination Acts did declare trade unions illegal.
Yeah.
And even before the 1799 legislation, there were a whole bunch of these acts linked to particular crafts and industries through the 18th century. And what the 1799 Act does, I think, is consolidate all that and declare trade unions illegal per se. However, there's been quite a bit of research on this and quite a bit of dispute and controversy over the effectiveness of this legislation.
Yeah.
It appears that quite a lot of trade unions continued to exist, to be created and continue to exist through the period of the Combination Acts. Yeah. So whilst they were technically illegal, there were a lot of trade unions that existed.
But it wasn't really enforced with any ferocity.
And so sometimes unions could get away with renaming themselves as friendly societies or whatever. So there was quite a lot of evasion of that. And some employers just didn't want to press the legislation because it might be antagonistic or provoke a strike. And so I think there was a little bit of flexibility in relation to the actual working of the Combination Acts and some ineffectiveness. And I suppose that theme runs through the 19th century, Kirsty, in terms of other legislation.
In terms of the history of unions and strikes.
We think of even
There's
the
a lot
Mines Acts or
there's
the
a lot
Workmen's
of
Compensation
informal
Acts.
things happening with strikes as well as formal things in trades unions, people just working. And again, you get the sense that, like you're saying, to prosecute all your workers for going on strike would be so time consuming and laborious that even if it was technically illegal, you probably wouldn't have
There are actually relatively few.
wanted to engage.
There are actually relatively few prosecutions under the Combination Acts.
Yeah.
But it does, and it's a great question. It does raise that point about the effectiveness of legislation, and that crops up again with the Mines Acts and Workmen's Compensation Acts and the like. I think there's always frequently a gap between legislation being passed and actual workplace practice, not least in the mines where things could be relatively easily evaded. But that's the issue with the Combination Acts, I think.
Yeah. And then there were a couple of questions about mobility in different senses. So one question about how far miners had to travel to work, to which I think the answer is that just really varied. You might be in a mining village that was quite close to the pit in which you worked. You might be walking 5 miles from, your tiny village in Lanarkshire to the nearest mine and then 5 miles back. Is that what you would say? I mean, certainly I've got examples of both, I think.
Yep, of course. But I think the other issue there is the travelling time from pit head to working face.
Yeah.
And that becomes a big issue for miners, particularly as mines got deeper and deeper, and the distance between pit head and the actual working place.
The actual workplace
grew. So and it wasn't unusual in the biggest pits for miners to have to walk 2 or 3 miles from shaft bottom to get to the
There are a lot of comments about the weather and that I've seen, about coming up from the pit and you're hot and you're sweating and it's winter, and then you in the Victorian period you might have to walk home 2 or 3 miles in your clothes, or walking in freezing cold winter mornings, and so it's an interesting question. And then there was a wider question about mobility, which was about why workers moved from one pit to another, which, obviously there could be a very wide variety of reasons. It could be simply seeking, a better rate of pay, or a better owner or manager, or a pit that came with better perks like housing or so forth. I think the question was asking, was there a lot of mobility partly because seams would dry up?
Yep.
And it's my impression that sometimes that was the case, but that mobility was sort of more widespread than that. This was just actually quite a mobile profession in which you didn't always spend your entire working life in one pit.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Because there was a lot of movement, seeking, as you say, better wages, better conditions. Sometimes miners would move to evade blacklisting and victimisation in their local communities. That was also an issue. We know that miners faced eviction from tied cottages during strikes, and we know blacklists circulated. So I think that was another significant reason. A great example of that during the general strike is the blacklisting and victimisation of the McGahey family, who had to move down from Scotland all the way to the Kent coalfield to get work. But it was about seams drying up, and I think mostly the migration there would have been locally within a fairly small distance. But
Victorian workers across all industries were a lot more mobile than I think we tend to perceive. We think you worked in the mines your whole life, the same mine, but actually for people to move around and between different kinds of mining and different industries. So, we sort of treat mining on this course as though it was your job and that was what you did. But there are so many examples of people who were miners for a period, then went off and did something else, then came back, then went off and did something different again. That it could be that you didn't just move about between different mines, you actually moved out of the mining and then back into it at different periods in your life. I don't know if that changes in the 20th century, but the Victorian workers were, they were multitaskers.
Yeah,
they was
true. That's very true.
They could turn their hand to lots of different industries.
Very true. But there were, having said that, I think there were stable mining communities too, where frequently folk would stay.
You follow your father into it. Yeah. But then that's the image we have, but it's not 100% of what was what was happening.
No. And I suppose with the 20th century, you then get the issue of pit closures for economic reasons, and miners scattering all over the place.
Yeah. And the last question I have, I think it's the last question, was about how it would be nice to have more images from the miners, like the pitman painters and so forth. And I noticed you'd added a link to the gallery at Bishop Auckland. It's great. Just a kind of slightly sad practical reason why we can't do that is because of image rights and copyright issues around circulating images on the internet. So it's both very difficult to get permissions and sometimes extremely expensive. That's why we're lucky to be in partnership with the museums, because a lot of the images that weren't freely available online, we only have permission to use them through those partnerships, which is great because it's enabled us to show you some nice photographs with the steps and the trades union banners, the lovely images that you negotiated for and we were able to include. But yeah, we should have a look at the pitman painters, but I sense that it might be tricky.
With the, yeah. But it would be nice to include some more, so I'll have a think about that.
Yeah.
So just to, are we done with our questions, Chrissy? I think we've got through everything.
I think we are, though. As I say, feel free to ask us more questions if you've now got new questions having heard this. We're happy to follow up.
So, just generally in terms of course review, Christy, what have you felt about the mining course? What do you think's been achieved by it? What would you take out of it compared to, say, the railway course that you did before?
I think it's gone really well. There was a difference in this course. It was we actually changed our thinking about the working lives courses as we've been going along. I thought there was some harder content in this one, actually, in terms of the level of historical information, which people seem to have responded well to. There was some more specifically literary content, like poems in quite difficult Scots. And, there was more general kind of Scottish and Northern content, whereas obviously the railways was much broader. So we were at some points talking about, Clarks and London. So this felt a bit more regional, so to speak, which is also true of the factories and mills. In fact, we were looking at Wales, we were looking at Scotland, we were looking at the north. People were mentioning lots of other places, but most of our sources were drawn from the areas around the museums we work with. There was this, and I felt comments on this, not surprisingly, and especially because we included, the interview with Nikki, were more politicised, and there was some good, angers and good links to contemporary politics. Which we saw in the railways course as well, but I think it's not at all surprising that you see more of it in a course on coal mining, because that history is so recent, and so raw for many people, and because so many of the people in this course have personal ties to the industry. Also true with railways, but I think again to a slightly lesser extent. But it's just been great to see people so interested and enthusiastic and engaging and questioning and answering each other and responding to each other and going away and looking up so many interesting links, some of which I'm sure we will steal for when we go in and revise the course and add more links. So we're never sure how much people want to see and whether you want 15 additional links to look at, but we kind of get the impression that maybe people taking these courses do want that. So yeah, it was good. And some of the things we included, from my perspective, like the songs were a bit, will people enjoy this, but the comments were generally positive and really interesting about those more kind of cultural, literary, musical aspects of representation of miners. What do you think? Because
I'm a newbie. I'm new to this, so
I'm pretty new as well.
But no, it's been a wonderful experience. I've really enjoyed it. But particularly the engagement with comments and the way in which learners have been very free and full with their comments and reflections. It seems to me we've got sort of almost two dimensions in the course. We've produced some material, we've put up some steps, we've developed some editorials and some videos and whatnot. But then there's the commentary. There's this other layer there from learners with experience, with knowledge. Or learners just curious about things, so they're asking lots of questions, lots of really stimulating, interesting questions. or I should say from those embedded within mining communities, the miners themselves. There's been some wonderful comments and wonderful personal experiences incorporated in the comments, and reflections from those within mining communities with parents, grandparents, other relatives, and that's been really wonderful. And I thought through that process we have got to grips with some of our core aims. Where we started was thinking about what work meant to folk in the Victorian period, how work was represented through a range of different sources, and how work changed over time.
Yeah.
And those were amongst our main sort of objectives and aims. I think we've got at some of that stuff. And to my mind, what's sort of been threaded through the course have been some key themes about the meaning of work, about the centrality of work to people's lives in the Victorian period, which I think is a key thing that's emerged from the course. But also the way in which this particular workplace impacted upon the body. That's been a recurring theme, I think, through all 4 weeks, through hewers, through child labourers, through surface workers, and in relation to trade unions and their policies, and advocacy in relation to occupational health and safety. And I think the key theme for me has been exploitation. This is an exploitative industry. It's an industry where workers have really felt the impact of these long working hours and tough, dangerous conditions upon their bodies, and that resulted in a high level of disability in these communities, and we've tried to trace that through. And finally, Kirsty, for me, what really emerges from the course is a sense of agency, that workers weren't just miners, and their families in the communities weren't just passive recipients of coal owners and labour management policies. They resisted, they transgressed, they organised, and I suppose the end of the course last week on trade unions has been a story of the ways in which workers in these communities did eventually come to establish and form strong trade unions. And those trade unions were the key force, I think, together with state intervention perhaps, in changing working lives for the better.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think we also set out to kind of think more broadly about industrial heritage, how you represent it through the voices of the workers themselves, which that thread has run through every week, but also its relevance to us today. Why do we have coal mining museums? What should they be representing? And so forth. And again, the comments, and I felt like in every step somebody was saying something about a current news story, or relating what they were reading to not just to the mining industry in the 20th and the 21st century, but to other issues going on in the world today. And that's really great and really important to think about how this history and heritage still matters and is still worth finding out about.
Yep. I loved some of the comments on the oral history step in week 4. It seems that a lot of folk are interested in doing their own oral histories of family members, or getting involved in oral history projects in the community, and that again is really important. And I guess emphasise the way in which that kind of intangible heritage can be pursued through individuals' own resources, and how important that is in relation to another element of heritage. Really, it's reconstructing or co-creating new oral histories in the community. So that was really exciting to see that.
So in conclusion, you should send all your oral histories to Arthur. He'll archive them in the Scottish Oral History Centre here at Strathclyde. And if you find any boxes of poems by your great grandparents who were miners under the bed, or are producing more poetry yourself, then you can send all that to me. I'd love to see it. But thanks very much. It's been great. And thanks again for your participation.
And do hope we see you or Kirsty sees you, I should say, on the textiles and factories course coming up.